All right. Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Rise Above Justice Movement, the podcast. My name is Zachary Mallory, and I am the host and the founder of the Rise Above Justice Movement and the Rise Above Justice Movement, the podcast. All right. Ooh, all right. This is gonna be this is gonna be a good one. We got a lot to talk about in a short amount of time, but without further ado, Oliver, you're running for Lieutenant Governor of California. This is huge. This is huge, 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 huge. Working families are running, and people from the working class are running across the country, bringing this true, bold leadership to make that change. You are no exception to that. I'm so excited to sit down and talk to you. And again, it's an honor. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much. It's Oliver. It's my honor to be here. I use the He series, and yeah, I'm an immigrant, a civil rights lawyer. I'm running for California Lieutenant Governor, and I've seen the work you've done and the organizing you've done. And so it's an honor to be here and to be able to have this conversation with you.
Let's dive in.
Let's do it.
What led you? Obviously, you have quite an impactful story. And I know bits and pieces of it because we've been collaborating on social media for a little bit, and there's been some recent interactions with federal agents. You also recently shared a story that was it kind of hit me in a different way. We'll dive into that if you feel like it. If not, we'll kind of move past it. But as a survivor, thank you for being vulnerable and sharing these parts of our stories that make up who we are as human beings.
Mhm.
And yeah, again, thank you for that. But before we get into your platform, before we get into anything, walk us through who you are and why you're running at a time that it feels like there's no sense of like hope, right? It feels like the joy has been sucked out of all of us. Like it feels like we don't have a path forward. Walk us through who you are and why you're running for lieutenant governor of California. Obviously, because
Yes.
you believe in it, but what's that backstory?
Well, I've actually never felt more hopeful than I do today.
Good.
And the reason is because as an attorney, I see that when you win through the legal system, it is temporary because another court can come and reverse your victory, like we saw with Roe versus Wade. When you win and pass a law through the legislature, that is temporary because another election, another legislature can come and reverse everything you've done, like we saw with Obamacare. The kind of change that really lasts is changing people's hearts and minds. Because if we're able to change the way people see Palestine or see immigrants, see ICE, the way they see the corporate landlords, the way they see capitalism, the way they see our politics, if we're able to change that, that is permanent. And those people will always build power. And we have seen that to a greater extent now than really ever before. I mean, the country has never been more pro-Palestine than they do today. The country has never been more abolish ICE than they are today. The country has never been more anti-war. Probably, well, I don't know how it was in the Bush years, but today there's a lot of sentiment for that, you know? In the Kern County Rapid Response Network, where I'm one of the co-leads, before Trump took office, we had about 20 volunteers, and now we have about 400. And that is what enables us when people call and say they have ICE in their neighborhoods. That is what enables us to send a team out in typically within 15 minutes to help them. That's what has enabled us to deliver food to thousands of families who've been afraid to go outside and go to work. And that matters more than elections, that matters more than lawsuits. Um, so I do feel a lot of hope. Now, myself, I am an immigrant. I moved to the US when I was 7 with my family. I grew up advocating a lot for my family. There was one instance where my grandma was detained by federal agents, profiled and detained. And I was the one who was making the phone calls and filling out the forms to get her out. And so, really, to keep on fighting for my family and my community, I went to Berkeley for undergrad, I went to Harvard for law school, and then came to the ACLU of Southern California to work as a civil rights lawyer. And in a lot of ways, that was my dream job. I got to work on so many of the issues that my family faced growing up. But last year, when Trump took office, as you can probably guess, some things changed. The very first Trump immigration raid in the entire country was in Bakersfield, where I work. Federal agents came through and they rounded up hundreds of farm workers. And so my team and I, we sued to stop this. And in April, we actually win. We won an injunction protecting the entire Central Valley from further illegal immigration raids. But what was very noticeable to me was Trump didn't care. His agents kept going, and it really showed me that we cannot rely on the courts to protect us. And instead, California has to step up. The lieutenant governor is president of the California State Senate. That's where I would be able to co-sponsor legislation to protect immigrants. There's three I want to push for in particular. Number one, shut down every single for-profit ICE prison we have in our state. There's eight for-profit ICE prisons in the state of California, and we got to shut them down. Number two is to hold these ICE thugs accountable when they do things like shooting moms and nurses and legal observers. And number three is funding our volunteer rapid response networks that are battling ICE all across our state. The lieutenant governor also chairs our state commission on economic development. That's where I want to fight for housing justice. I worked for 2 years in eviction defense, representing working families against their slumlords, organizing tenant unions, organizing rent strikes, and so fighting for that. Empowering the housing justice movement, taking on the corporate landlords that are buying up so many homes. That's a real priority for me. And then lastly, our lieutenant governor here in California is also on our UC, Cal State, and community college board of regents. And in that position, I want to make our public universities tuition free. I want to make housing affordable for students. And I want to do so by divesting California from genocide and apartheid in Palestine. Our University of California school system have $34 billion invested in genocide and apartheid. And if we divest that and use it to build housing, we can make sure every single public university student in the state has affordable housing.
You would think in 2026, everything you just stated would be common sense, right? But obviously, in a lot of different spaces, common sense is not in the same room as like you and I are, right? And there's a really big slate of California governors. I think there's five or six that are running for lieutenant governor. So you have a little bit of smaller, but there is some like big personalities, right? So, you know, on the topic of like affordability, so I've only been to one part of California, and it was Anaheim. And it was for a conference with the Human Rights Campaign. I used to be a youth ambassador with the Human Rights Campaign. And I used to go to different conferences and, speak and attend different panels and like different things like that. But we walked around, and I grew up in Missouri. Okay. I don't have palm trees. So that was definitely different for me. I was like, okay, this is really cool. But in regards to affordability, let's kind of dive into that a little bit. So whenever you've been out like talking to people, what are some of those concerns that you're hearing about affordability?
Affordability is absolutely everything. I canvass every weekend, so I talk to voters every weekend. And people, everything is so expensive in California. Gas,
Yeah.
obviously, housing, healthcare, home insurance, car insurance, electricity. People are really getting squeezed. And with Zoran's win, I think we really see affordability as the new hot word in politics. The left is using it. The Democrats, corporate Democrats are using it. The Republicans are using it. Everyone's talking about it. For me, you cannot deliver affordability without abolishing ICE. You cannot deliver affordability without taking on the corporate landlords. You cannot deliver affordability without freeing Palestine. Because the reason things are so unaffordable, even though our taxes are so high, is because so much of our public resources are being used by these corporate special interests to profit. Each immigrant in ICE detention here in California costs taxpayers anywhere from $100,000 to millions of dollars per person. That's where all of our resources are going. right? $34 billion invested in companies that profit from genocide and apartheid. That's where all our resources are going. The fact that 50% of the city of LA's budget is going to the cops, that's where our resources are going. The fact that we are subsidizing the fossil fuel industry, giving them taxpayer money while they gouge prices and are making billions of dollars in profits. That is where our public resources are going. And the only way we can deliver affordability is by doing away with all of those corrupting influences and their puppet politicians and focusing on making housing, healthcare, and education affordable for people.
Yeah, absolutely. And I want to correct something I said earlier. There's like 11 candidates running for lieutenant governor, right? There's quite a few, right?
There's quite a few. Yeah.
I mentioned about five just a little bit ago, but there's definitely more than that. I just looked and I
Mhm.
was like, oh, there's definitely more than five. So I just wanted to correct that just for the record. So it's still quite a bit, and there's some big personalities, and there's a lot of different ideas, and each of you have some really good ideas. They're just different ways of getting to that point, right? But obviously, if I like I mentioned to you before we started recording, if I was in California, you would be the one that I would be out canvassing for 100%. Just want to throw that out there. What are some of the other concerns that you're hearing outside of like affordability? But ICE. You mentioned, Bakersfield was one of the first targeted places for ICE, right? And
Mhm.
we saw what's happening in Los Angeles. And I've been watching that religiously. I have friends that live in Los Angeles, and that is an area that I personally have not visited just yet, but I can see that on the horizon. But in regards to like ICE and DHS, what are some of the other concerns that you're hearing whenever you're out canvassing and you're talking to people outside of affordability? Because there's a lot more that kind of goes around that. But what else are you hearing? What else are you seeing?
Yeah, a really ICE and affordability, I would say, are probably the two most common ones. Defending democracy is a really common one against Trump. And I always remind people when I speak to people like that we cannot have faith in the corporate traditional Democratic Party.
Mhm.
This is a party that in the last 10 years has lost not once, but twice to fascism. And so there's something really seriously wrong with this party, and that something very seriously wrong. I think there's a few factors. For me, one of the big ones is the fact that this party will routinely tell 80% of its voters to shut up and get in line so it can cash a check. The things that you and we talk about that we believe in, they are not just broadly popular among Democrats, they're broadly popular in the nation. The fact that uh, immigrant families belong together instead of in for-profit ICE prisons. That's common sense. The fact that housing should be for regular people instead of corporate landlords. That's common sense. The fact that we should invest our resources into kids here instead of bombing kids in Palestine. That's all common sense. But the party refuses to take these common sense positions because they are cashing checks from corporations. They're cashing checks from the corporate landlords. They're cashing checks from APAC. They're cashing checks from the same detention centers that are donating to Republicans. And so when you routinely tell your voters to shut up and get in line so you can cash a check, at some point they're going to abandon you. At some point they're going to see you as a party with no values. And that's why they lose. And so that's what I tell folks in that boat. Another thing that has been really surprising to me on the campaign trail is the issue of Palestine, because you and I probably both grew up thinking that Palestine is a really controversial issue that you're not really allowed to talk about, and that very much is still the case. I mean, we've all seen students and people lose their jobs over their Free Palestine speech, but and so when I talk to voters, especially if they're not who you would typically think as progressive, I'll put the Palestine stuff last. I'll save it for the end.
Mhm.
And, so I'll go through my urge spiel. And what I've seen over and over again is I'll go through my spiel and the voter is like, oh, okay, okay, so this is what politicians always say. And then I get to Palestine and they're like, why didn't you lead with that? That would have saved us so much time. And they sign up to volunteer, they give me money. Palestine has become incredibly, incredibly important to people, not just because it's about human rights, not just, although that's obviously for me the most important, not just about our tax dollars, but because it is such a good litmus test to see who is willing to take on the issues of justice against power and against almost unlimited money on the other side.
What are some of the steps that you would take to address money in politics? Because, whoo, it goes into a lot because you're right. I I'm going to tell you this. So I come from a background of Democrats, and as far as like my grandparents go, my
Mhm.
grandfather was an Air Force veteran. So obviously, veterans and healthcare is something that's very near and dear to me, which we'll dive into here in just a little bit.
Yeah.
But also like union organizing and protecting union organizers and protecting people who go on strike. A lot of nurses across the country have went on strike and they've been on strike out in California. SAG-AFTRA, and like looking at the acting unions and the writers unions, like thinking about all of this, what are some of those steps that you would take to just protect people that are speaking up and speaking out?
Yes, there are a ton that we can do um, to protect people who are speaking out. And then there's also a ton that I think goes beyond electoral politics. So, in terms of
Mhm.
what I can do as lieutenant governor, um, the California lieutenant governor is president of the state senate, and that's where I can co-sponsor legislation. California passed a really bad law last year that put anti-Semitism monitors across the state in our public education system. And but the problem is the way they define anti-Semitism is any criticism of Israel is anti-Semitic. And so it is really putting a lot of pressure on teachers, high school teachers especially, to not have free speech in their classrooms. So that's one that I would be very eager to repeal. Our school system has had a habit of using an iron fist to crush students who are expressing free speech, especially pro-Palestine speech, especially pro-trans speech on campus.
Mhm.
And then when the Trump administration comes and wants to do immigration enforcement on campus, wants to target students for their free Palestine speech, our universities bend over for them and do whatever Trump wants. And that's something I would want to reverse on the UC Board of Regents. But the core of all of these problems is money in politics. It's because of these moneyed interests and their political puppets. So, how do we fight that? Especially with the Supreme Court and Citizens United. To be candid, there isn't a lot that someone in California state government can do to fight against a Supreme Court ruling like Citizens United. California cannot pass a law that says, corporations cannot spend millions of dollars on politics. But I think there is reason to be hopeful. We saw in New York City with Zohran Mamdani's victory that he registered 100,000 volunteers. And now that he's mayor, these 100,000 people that they trained are helping other progressives. They are organizing tenant unions. They are getting involved in rapid response networks. And in New York City, they've really built a structure, a power structure, where if you're a progressive running for office and you don't take corporate money, you start two steps ahead instead of two steps behind. And some of our organizers on my team are from Zoran's campaign. And what they told me is Zoran's team pretty much only hired from New York City DSA. And that's because they have that power structure there. And so what we need to do is to also build that power structure here in California so that when progressives who don't take corporate money run for office in California, they start two steps ahead instead of two steps behind. That's what is so exciting about my campaign. We have now registered 5,000 volunteers with the campaign, more than all of my opponents put together. Last weekend, we had 24 canvases around the state. I don't think any of my opponents had a single canvas. And I'm the first candidate in California history to be endorsed by the California DSA for a statewide office. And so this campaign really is setting the groundwork and the foundation for progressive power in the state of California. And I'm hoping we can build what they have in New York City. And in my mind, that is how we can defeat corporate power, is by building and organizing and building grassroots power, which is so much more powerful than the Supreme Court and whatever bullshit they're up to.
Yeah, exactly. And I think the most recent ruling from them in regards to like Louisiana and like the redistricting that we're seeing across the country. And California also redistricted it, but the thing is, it went to the voters. It went to the people, right? The people approved it, right? And it's just common sense that whenever a government works for the people thrive, people are happy, and they're going to get out. They're going to vote for candidates that understand the working class versus the corporation versus APAC. They understand about the protecting the right to free speech. Speaking of free speech, people lost their jobs for speaking out against what Charlie Kirk believed. People were doxxed left and right,
Mhm.
literally. And I want to kind of pivot here for a second and talk about like trans rights and, California remains like a safe haven for trans people.
Yes.
And I'm just gonna say it. The current governor, Gavin Newsom, has thrown trans people under the bus more than once. He's also vetoed several bills that would have also had protections for trans people. And I am very critical of this because, he has presidential aspirations. That is not who we need to represent us as a country because that's not who we are. And protecting marginalized communities is absolutely critical. So, in regards to trans people and the LGBTQ plus community, what would you add or what would you do to ensure that trans people and LGBTQ people not only have a seat at the table, but are also helping influence change in the state of California? Because there's a difference in having a seat at the table versus having a seat at the table and also helping create that change. Because
Yeah.
anybody can have a seat at the table, but how are we incorporating them into the conversation? That's the $1 million question.
Yes. So I support trans youth having access to gender affirming care the way that everyone should have access to healthcare. I support trans youth being able to play on the sports teams that match who they are. Um, and to ensure that we are building trans power in our state, I want to talk a little bit about my values as an elected official. So, as an attorney, my job should not be to tell my clients what to do just because I have a fancy law degree. My job is to go to my clients, ask them, what do you want done? And how can I use my legal skills to help you get that thing done? That is the same value I want to take into elected office, where it's not my job to go to communities and say, you can have a seat at the table, you're my advisors, like you can kind of shape what I do. No, that's reverse of what we should have, which is my job is to go to communities, see them as my clients, and say, what do you want to see done? And take my direction from them. And this is how I can use the power or the knowledge of my office to help you get that thing done. Right? California has thousands of communities, hundreds of thousands of issues, and I'm never going to be an expert on even 1% of that. And so
Mhm.
I really value being able to have not just conversation, not just have them at the table, but to take my direction from communities such as the trans community, such as, the Palestinian community, such as the immigrant community, et cetera, et cetera.
Yep, no, 100%. And I think, we saw in 2024 with the presidential election that the genocide in Gaza is definitely a deciding factor for a lot of people, right? And
Yep.
I think it's absolutely critical to recognize that APAC has such a very strong influence in politicians on both sides of the aisle. And it should not be controversial to say that we do not want our tax dollars going to aid and abet a genocide. And it goes beyond Gaza. It also goes into Sudan. It goes into Congo. It goes into all of these other places. And there's genocide is genocide. Genocide is wrong. You know, the mass distinction of people alone should alarm people. So whenever it comes to divesting and whenever it comes to recognizing a genocide as a genocide, this goes along lines of getting the money out of politics, which again, like you said, not a lot that you could do like on like a California level. But I think just kind of being outspoken about it, it can also leave those rippling effects to where because there's a lot of really, really progressive candidates that are, and I use progressive as like an actual true progressive. I feel that progressive gets thrown around. Cory Booker
Hmm.
is not progressive. Cory Booker does not represent even his own constituents. Cory Booker is on a book tour. Dude, what the fuck are you doing? Seriously. Um, but it goes beyond that, right? And it's this complex issue that comes down to we need to overturn Citizens United on a national level. And does it take a constitutional amendment? Does it take right? The DNC shot down the resolution that was brought up by base members that are members of the DNC. They shot it down to get that PAC money out of elections. And more specifically, APAC, getting APAC money out of elections, they shot it completely down. The DNC leadership is not meeting the current moment. The base wants change, but the leadership is pushing back on that change. And they're like, oh, maybe we can do this and do that. No, if you're going to get money out of politics, you need to get money out of politics. There is no ifs, ands, or buts. Protecting people and their right to literally exist should not be a controversial topic. In
Yep.
2026, again, Oliver, you would think this would all be common sense, but oftentimes, like I said earlier, common sense is oftentimes not in the rooms, yet alone at the table.
Yep.
You know this as well as I do. You and I align very closely. I already feel that. I already know that. But to anybody out there, who might be feeling like I need an Oliver running in my area, well, I recommend everybody look at the candidates that are running, do your research, look at the FEC filings, look at opensecrets.org. Track APAC has been keeping track of like the pro Israel lobby. Look at things like that and make the informed decisions and educate others about these candidates because Oliver, running for lieutenant governor of California is obviously a really big role. It's a really big opportunity to get somebody in there who really does give a damn about the working class. What has been your experience? What are you hearing as far as like feedback from people? What are you like the momentum that you're building is deeply inspiring. I think we all see that. You have a social media presence that's literally off. Like you said, a lot of your organizers, a lot of the people on your team come from Zoro's team. Phenomenal job on like educating the public about the issues that are impacting your constituents. But whenever you travel the state, what are you hearing? Not necessarily like we already kind of like addressed like the concerns, but as far as like feedback, like after you speak at an event, do people come up to you and say, oh, thank you for saying this, thank you for saying that? What is some of that feedback that you're hearing from people in regards to what you're doing?
Yeah. The feedbacks are great. I mean, we'll go to events and people. Yesterday we were at an event in front of a detention center, and after I spoke, like people lined up to take selfies, and a woman was like, "You're going to be president one day," and people said, "Good, good speech, et cetera, et cetera." So the feedback is really great, and that helps energize me. It's actually surprising how little hate we have gotten on the campaign trail. Even when people do disagree, they are pretty um, civil and they will, explain their disagreement. And I enjoy those conversations and being able to listen to them and see if we can find a synthesis of what we believe. Um, yeah, I think Palestine is a really big one. People really respect that we're able to use that word, that we're able to use genocide, that we're able to use the word divest. Um, and yeah, I mean, we kind of have our head down, and we're just focused on what we're doing. We do feel there's a lot of momentum. Like I said, 24 canvases across the state. That's I'm pretty sure more canvases than even any of the governor candidates have done. So it's a really grassroots campaign, and we're hoping to keep doing that until we win.
Let's pivot into, and this will be the last talking point because I know we're coming up on time here shortly. Thinking about healthcare, you know, this is a huge topic across the country. As far as
Yeah.
healthcare goes, how would you, one, protect the access to healthcare, but also advocate for the expansion of healthcare? You mentioned about co-sponsoring as a part of being, chair of the Senate and et cetera. But thinking about healthcare in its current state, what's working, what's not working, and how would you address some of those concerns around healthcare?
Is there anything working in healthcare? Um,
Not in
yeah, I
capitalism.
right, exactly. I was born in Beijing, and when I was born, the US life expectancy was 8 years longer than the Chinese life expectancy. And if you had told my parents back then that it would be different today, and I wasn't born that long ago, if you told them it would be different today, they wouldn't believe you. But today, the American life expectancy is shorter than the Chinese life expectancy. While China is not as wealthy, while China is spending way less into their healthcare system than the US is. The reason our healthcare system is collapsing, the reason life expectancy is not growing, the reason our healthcare system is so disgustingly expensive is because we have a for-profit healthcare model where these companies are trying to squeeze every last dime out of us, where insurance companies can charge 10 times for medication, 100 times for medication compared to what they charge in Mexico or Canada, where your insurance company can take all this expensive premium from you, and then right when you need care, they have their lawyer tell you you're denied coverage. Um, that is not right. And it is also not right that people are putting off getting healthcare because it is so expensive until they are desperately sick. And so I have endorsed California's universal healthcare proposal called CalCare, which would make healthcare single payer and universal in the state of California. And not only is that more just because people then will get access to healthcare that don't have access today, but it will also be way more efficient and way more affordable because people aren't waiting until they're desperately sick to get care. Grandmas, like my grandma, doesn't have to be the one negotiating against big pharmaceutical companies, and instead California can be negotiating in her stead.
Yes, 100%. Thank you for talking about that because universal health care would also, it's just, again, it's just common sense. And a big issue with me is the lack of healthcare coverage that a lot of our communities are facing. We're seeing rural hospitals closing down due to the Medicaid cuts and the Medicare cuts, and they're no longer able to afford keeping their operations. I just sat down and talked to Rob, who's running for Congressional District 3 in Arkansas. And one of the big hospitals that's in Fort Smith is getting ready to shut its doors because they can no longer operate due to the cuts of Medicare and Medicaid.
Yep.
That's not a rural hospital. Fort Smith is a really popular city in Arkansas, right? And it's not just rural areas. Rural is obviously getting hit, absolute hardest. I've been interviewing candidates that are running in rural districts, and a lot of the issues that we're seeing here in Kansas, where I am based, are impacting in Iowa. They're
Mm,
impacting Arkansas. They're impacting in Missouri. They're impacting some in California.
yes.
It's widespread, and it's very obvious that trickle down economics is a failure. It is a systemic failure. It is a policy choice. The violence that we are seeing in regards to gun violence, domestic violence,
Mm,
a lot of it stems from poverty. Whenever we address poverty, we will start to see things improve. But until then, we're going to continue having a over militarization police. We have Donald Trump's secret agents and secret police literally running rampant in our communities.
Yep.
We obviously need to abolish ICE, which I know that you're a big support of. But in regards to people contributing to your campaign and uplifting the work that you were doing, how can they do so and where can they
Yep.
find you?
Yeah. So we are running a really grassroots campaign. We're not taking money from corporations. And that's actually served us really well because it allows us to speak honestly. It allows us to speak from the heart. It allows us to speak with power instead of say the things that corporations are paying us to say. And so we're at 5,000 volunteers. We are training these volunteers not to tell my story, but really to build power, to uh, do relational organizing, to get involved in the union movement, to know their rights against ICE, to storytell. And that is how we're going to build the kind of lasting change that we need to topple some of these really entrenched corrupting influences in our politics. So if people want to contribute to that, either by canvassing, by phone banking, by making a grassroots donation, they can do so at oliverma2026.com. I think the core of our campaign is about toppling these corporate influences and their puppet politicians and building the California of our dreams. A California where housing is cheap, where healthcare is free, where immigrants are safe. And if that sounds like the California or the nation of their dreams, then I hope folks get involved and support our campaign.
100%. Oliver, thank you so much for coming on the podcast today, obviously having this conversation with me. And I look forward because your primary is on June 2nd, correct?
Yes,
So it's
that's right.
coming up very soon. So, again, good luck to you. Thank you so much for having this conversation with me and letting me know more about your platform. And I think it will help people be able to kind of like narrow down those candidates that are going to represent the people, not a corporation, not APAC. Um, Again, thank you so much. I appreciate you.
Thanks for the work you do. Right. When we talk about changing people's hearts and minds, that's exactly what you're doing to thousands of people. And so I applaud you for that. And I hope to be in this fight with you for decades more.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. I appreciate you.
Bye.